child, if that child misbehaves, or if she does anything to upset you, please, I'm begging you, do not shout at her, do not beat her up, but come and talk to us, and we'll find a way of gently making her understand. And the man said, I have understood. So quickly he left, and he was now walking so fast, looking forward to getting home, meeting his wife, and seeing this child from the mushrooms. So he gets home. Wow! He is so excited. He runs, he hugs his wife, and he says, is this our child? And the wife says, yes. She just came into the house and she said she's from the mushroom country. And the husband explained everything that had happened. Oh, and they just hugged the little girl and they just loved her. And so their days were full of joy. But one day, the little girl from the mushroom country, her name was Chigumbukumbu. So she accidentally pushed one very special clay pot that was in the house, and it broke. And the mother was so upset. She shouted the most terrible, awful words. You silly, stupid girl from the mushroom country. I know it. Children from a mushroom, what good can they be? You are so naughty. And the little girl started to cry. In no time, she disappeared. And the husband said, where's she gone? We've lost her. And the wife said, you hurry now, go to your mushroom and tell them all that has happened and apologize if necessary and see if they can give us that girl back. She's ours, not theirs. And so the husband went back to the mushrooms and gently and humbly asked if that baby child girl could come back and be their child again. Now, I will have to end here. I could tell you more about, so there are 3 more incidents that happen after this, but again, it's more of a test in terms of, nature and human beings, how, we are so different, and how nature is trying to teach us something. Because then the husband goes back, the child comes back, the woman again forgets, or rather when she discovers that the mushrooms can actually grant wishes, she sends the husband to go and request, for a very nice, big house, and they get the house, and then she starts requesting for other things. But ultimately, because she's ill-treating the young child, then ultimately they lose everything. But then the husband eventually also decides to go and stay with the mushrooms as a mushroom. But I've just now sort of squeezed, the story. But let me say, I am a Shona storyteller from a country called Zimbabwe, which is a former British colony. And we got our independence 43 years ago. And I am here to talk about how indigenous stories deal with environment issues, which include living things such as plants, animals, people, and even those tiny, tiny insects. So in order to give an accurate and complete picture, I will look at indigenous stories as part of African literature that covers folk tales, myths, ballads, fables. Actually, this is a definition that we get from Ruth Finnegan. So I would have also loved to add what Finnegan leaves out, that is riddles, proverbs, and taboos to the list. For those of you who, from Africa, you understand the role of taboos. We grew up with taboos. You are told you cannot do this, you cannot do that. And especially, most of our taboos had to do with the environment. And so if I had time, I would have loved to talk about proverbs, about taboos, because both proverbs and taboos are not only traditional wisdom, but they've been more, you can say, in our Shona world, approved for the maintenance of certain standards or norms of social behavior in the community. So both, were part of the indigenous Zimbabwean law book, which was not written. They were used to instruct, to correct, to reprimand, or to regulate excesses in behavior, as well as instilling fear in certain social dissidents by outlining maybe dire consequences that would befall people who crossed lines. You will notice I will be talking about my people's folklore in the past tense because, as someone once said, authentic collections of the traditional praises, myths, stories with their songs, proverbs, children's word games, and nursery rhymes, these are rapidly disappearing from use and memory, especially in towns where the radio, television, sports, and other forms of entertainment are taking place and taking time that was traditionally given to, storytelling and oral classics. So this is something that was an observation that was made by one George Fortune some 54 years ago, before the advent of internet and social media, which we know has now further worsened the situation of folklore in Zimbabwe. I can testify that before cities and roads were built, the African lived in close contact and communion with the environment, both flora and fauna. And I'm one such African who identifies with the words of the German folklorist, if you know of Jacob Grimm, who said, although there is almost no district which is completely devoid of folklore and stripped of it, nevertheless, it is provincial towns rather than big cities and villages rather than provincial towns. And among the villages, he says, it is the ones which are most of all quiet and impassable, those villages located in the forests or in the mountains. It is these which are most endowed and blessed with folklore. Now, coming back to my village was located in the forests, and if there was an animal sound, I could tell you what animal had made that sound, and whether the sound was communicating something, and whether I needed to be cautious or not. Just by looking at even the droppings of an animal, I could tell you what animal had made that deposit, the approximate time it had done the act, and whether it was alone or possibly in a group. I knew the habits and behaviors of birds, snakes, and insects. I once even saw two gun-metallic black mambas entangled and twisting, moving very fast past my bare feet. When the stories my grandmother told me involved some animals. These animals, birds or insects, so they would make the stories that grandma told me become so real, so rich, because they were part of my world. I was seeing all these animals, all these creatures. And before colonization and contact-induced change, the Shona people used to value kinship, um, belonging and a sense of community. So you have Shona traditional praises, Shona traditional myths, stories with their songs and proverbs, children's word games and nursery rhymes. These were actually part of a larger variety of verbal styles of speech. They formed part of the common repertoire of ordinary people and were in daily functional use. And it is important for me to say daily. You could not imagine a day that could go by without you either, getting to hear traditional praises, myths, stories, songs that, were part of our lives. So the recitation of oral poetry was widely diffused in Shona society. There were certain social occasions which demanded and encouraged it, that is, the performance, and also certain social relationships which received appropriate expression by means of, these oral forms of expression. So these situations and relationships were those of ordinary people, and hence they were part of their social role to be learned. You just had to learn, these in order to be part of the community. So the spoken word artistry was commonplace among the Shona people, but the dismantling of indigenous social organization resulted in things falling apart, such that the diffusion of these art forms throughout society is now rare, with actually even the social occasions and social relationships which promoted these events are now, here and there. So social change no longer makes it necessary or important for one to learn the social roles or practice them. I can say the Shona people were rooted, as in, having roots similar to a tree. So they had a very close relationship with the earth and even called each other Mwanawevu. So when the Shona people call each other Mwanawevu, we are simply saying, you are a child of the soil. So it's a title that if I am to address, somebody who is a Shona person as hello Mwanawevu, I'm simply saying, hello, child of the soil. They won't really look at me in surprise and say, what are you talking about? No, they really understand. That's how deep the connection was. So when an African died in the city, you find that their body was transported back home for burial on home soil. And this is still happening today when, Zimbabweans die in foreign countries. So the title child of the soil does not mean that we believe that the soil mothered us, but rather it speaks of a deep relationship we have with the earth. So you'll find that during the installation of a new chief, the chief took an oath holding fistfuls of soil and promised to look after the earth and everything that grew and walked and depended on the soil. That is the trees, the grass, the animals, the birds, and everything. So chiefs were not necessarily rulers, but they were custodians of the land and its resources on behalf of God. This is why among the Shona people, traditionally, land was never sold, but it was given to whoever needed it. So traditionally, storytelling was our classroom, a classroom, and the storyteller was a teacher. So I'm still a teacher, but in a limited way. As a storyteller, I tell the stories of my people, stories that my grandmother told me before I could read or write, before I knew that there was a language called English, or that our country had been colonized by the British. Besides the traditional folk tales, I also create and tell new stories, because some of the stories that my grandmother told me were created and shaped by the historical conditions which produced those stories. So I believe that a good storyteller tells stories that are relevant, because even the stories that we consider to be traditional were not traditional at one point. They did not even exist, but only came into existence because someone created them and others heard the stories and retold them, adding new dimensions. So, as a creative person, I sometimes reboot. For those, I think we have a filmmaker, among us. I think it was who was it who was talking about, I think it's Ruth Nazimba, who was talking about she's into filmmaking. So as a creative person, I sometimes reboot stories that I heard from my grandmother. In cinematic language, a reboot takes an old story and jumpstarts it. It gives a fresh start, a child life into the old. And I how storytelling should be, because according to the philosophy of my people, it is the storyteller who dies, but not the story. So you'll find among the Shona people, there's a philosophy. When a story comes to an end, we say, Ndipo pakafira sarungano. We are saying, this is where the storyteller died. He could not continue with the story because he died. But he may be dead, but the story that he was telling lives on. It continues. It will be told by those who were among his audience, and they will continue with it. So, having said what I've said so far, you are probably beginning to see how indigenous stories talk about or deal with environmental issues. Traditionally, the stories were told by people who had a fraternalism with their flora and fauna, such that the Shona do not refer to the animal characters in their folk tales just as, oh, a hyena, a baboon, a lion, etc. And I want you to pay attention to this. The Shona people who actually refer to the animal characters in their folk tales as uncle hyena, uncle baboon, uncle lion, uncle elephant, and so forth. You can see that kinship, like I said, was greatly valued, to the extent of that very same kinship being extended to the animal world. It's also even extended to Mother Earth. It's also extended to the plants and the trees that are growing in the forest. So individualism is an African, as even one white Rhodesian said, making an observation. He said, in matters concerning our own families, I have found that generally speaking, Africans display a degree of responsibility that puts the European to shame. He says the vast majority of African men, one finds they are giving financial assistance to elderly relatives or other dependents, or assisting to educate brothers, even through, so you find even if their own assets and incomes may be small. So generosity was part of, who we were. And you can actually see that even when we get into our relationships with nature, nature gives a generous person, and a stingy person in folktales is usually denied what they are looking for. So the Shona believed that as a people, we are not islands. If, for those of you who know the poem by John Donne, no man is an island, but you find that together with the flora and the fauna, we were part of, the main. So the Shona people extended the idea of their brotherhood with animals through totems. So what I can tell you is all Shona people have a totem as a form of identity. And the totems are either wild animals or some natural land formation. So the use of totems by Africans or by Shona people confirms that brotherhood with animals. So if Shona people use a particular animal as their totem, it becomes taboo for them to hunt, to kill, to injure, or do anything bad to that animal. The animal would no longer be viewed as a danger or viewed as food, but as a brother. It seems the fellowship between the animal and the group of people using that animal totem is something that goes a very long time back in history, probably when men and animals could speak with each other. So you find, as a hunting people, the Shona people greatly respected and avoided confrontation with their totem animal. It was even believed to be a taboo for someone to be killed by their totem animal. So a Shona person who uses a particular animal for a totem can be addressed by the name of the particular animal without taking offense. So I can say, Hannah, you are a lion, and I'll just say, hi, lion, or hi, eland, or whatever animal, without you saying, oh, I'm not an animal. But because of the totemic, identity, they are simply acknowledging that connection. So actually, it is a sign of great respect, if one is addressed by their totem. And totem animals are further celebrated by the Shona through the composing of totemic praise poetry, whereby the good and bad qualities of the animal were studied and captured as lines of poetry. I felt I should probably share an example of praise poetry for my totem, which is the baboon. So people will be addressing me. So they will be saying, "Thank you, baboon, you who walks arrogantly, possessor of a booming voice, the expert tree climber, the raider of fields of crops. You who showers once a year when it rains." So it's so traditional, but it is while it may sound as if the totemic praise poem is addressing the animal that is being used as the emblem, it is exclusively for the people and not the baboon or the animal in the forest. So when the people who identify with that baboon, when they meet the baboon in the forest, they may just salute or greet the baboon, more to acknowledge the fraternity, but not to start reciting lines of poetry for the baboon or the animal. It's just, a form of identity.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we really have enjoyed this session. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. But before we move forward, I just want to call Ana Rosa, who will just give us a brief talk, just introduction, because she has been the heart and soul of this project. Just give us a few, as we write our comments about what our questions may be about storytelling. We have heard the different stories that he has told us today. If you have any questions, as you write them in the chat, I just want Anna to just give us, just for 5 minutes or even less, she could talk about this project and how you can get involved if you're not involved in this amazing project. And please go ahead, Ana Rosa.
Oh, thank you, Hannah. So thank you very much, Ignatius. It was very interesting to hear your stories. So the idea is to have these meetings is actually to start a group of indigenous storytellers in this moment with the Bosch Alumni Network, and maybe move into other partners as well, other perspectives as well. So our idea is also that we can start connecting and listen to each other's stories. So see the perspective from, like last month we saw from Jonas Guajajara, the Brazilian indigenous perspective, and we connect as well with Ignatius' perspective, and also that we think, just like he just said that at some moment the stories were not traditional stories, so at some moments they were created. And I found it in our very first meeting, so our almost pre-meeting, people were also talking about, okay, I also want to have some kind of interaction with it. So one thing that we say, okay, let's try to do some drawings, or to after all this input that we receive, we reflect on that here in the group, and also draw something to bring our perspective as well of what's the of our stories, that as well, of how can we connect with it, how can we bring our perspectives, how can we see the stories in our locations or in our own. Yeah, so the idea is about having the space for this interaction to happen.
Thank you so much. I had to have that introduction because some people came later and some people would really want to be involved. So now they know how to get involved. And we have a very good question here from Munini, who says, how are we blending the storytelling as done in one of the spaces of the digital media or spaces, and in one way or the other, how do you think indigenous storytelling has changed, and how do you think we can come back to indigenous storytelling? I think Anna had her up. You can go ahead and communicate. I don't know if you had your you wanted to go.
Yeah, but I was going to, so basically, like,
yes,
if anyone still doesn't get the emails them sending, please send the email on the on the chat, so I can add you to the email list. So only that we can communicate, and please, we can exchange more. So
yes, yeah, for sure. So Ignatius, if you could answer this question about how we can blend storytelling in one space in this digital media era, and I'm seeing here, what advice would you give indigenous storytellers, and how do you think the art of indigenous storytelling has changed? How could you advise us as a young generation moving forward, especially some of us that want to get into writing, into having some of these stories told, but acknowledging the people that wrote these stories? How do we do that? Please, Ignatius, if you have a few comments about that.
Thank you very much for that question. You will notice, I think traditional folktales or traditional stories must respond to social change. If they fail to respond to social change, they will become irrelevant. This, I'm speaking from experience, where you find that sometimes, because we fail to allow our stories to take advantage of new ways or new, let me just say, new media, and we want to keep them, you know, as they were, as some of us heard them from our grandmothers. we then miss the opportunity to actually share and sell the beauty of the art with the younger generation, who are now probably more aware of Peppa Pig, than our indigenous stories. So it is really something that we need to urgently look into. I know there are two schools of thought. There are those who insist, don't dare touch our traditional stories, keep them as as they used to be. Don't allow our characters from traditional folk tales to even be found on social media or in the form of films. But we look at Disney, for example, coming to Africa to take our indigenous stories and put them on the big screen. They did that also in France. So are we then going to just sit and watch and just say, oh yeah, we have? I am so much against how we want to freeze tradition and say, let us just preserve. But if you preserve without allowing tradition to actually start latching onto new developments, you are going to ultimately lose big time. So I think we need to start exploring, just like I think was it Ruth, start exploring these spaces, experimenting, trying to see what will work. Let's I think Anna talked about an interaction. Let's share information, exchange ideas, and start doing something instead of just saying, oh, we used to have folk tales. We used to have a very rich heritage of storytelling. Let us find ways of making that be relevant to today's audiences.
Very good answer, and thank you so much for that observation and that response. Is there any project you're working on in terms of this indigenous storytelling, especially climate change, and how can we partner with you in the sense of that? Where you're working right now in the space of where you are, and also for us as young people who are trying to also join, as I had asked, is there anything you can tell us to, like, maybe, because for you, you're in storytelling, what would you tell someone starting off to have in mind, someone starting off, especially that wants to delve in that area?
Thank you very much for that good question. Starting point, go back in history, try to research and collect as much traditional stories, as many traditional stories as you can. It is only when you understand where you are coming from, when you understand the traditional stories that were told by your people, that you can actually become better placed and positioned to take them forward. You need a foundation, or you need somewhere to start from. So invest time in collecting these stories. I've enjoyed listening to stories from Uganda, from Kenya, from Nigeria. You find there's something that is common among us that is communicated through these stories. So let us say, yes, let that be a starting point. So you find that when you try to even innovate or reboot, like I said, if you remember the term that I used, when you try to reboot those traditional stories, it will actually be almost seamless. You find it will work very well because you have a very good understanding of these characters, the themes, and so forth. Which brings me to the second part of your, which was the first of your question. I'm currently working with the Zambezi Conservation Society in Zimbabwe. They are mainly looking at educating people through stories, specifically dealing with human-wildlife conflict. So there's so much, sometimes so much anger. People will just go kill animals because, you know, a hyena has eaten your goat, or this is happening. So they've realized our people, you know, appreciate problems that are, well, at least that are explained, and solutions that come through the form of, you know, storytelling. So this is where now I'm coming in, working with them to find ways of using storytelling so that we bring out these issues, you know, issues of poaching, issues of, you know, people encroaching into spaces where animals, you know, used to live, because, you know, the human population is growing, and we continue pushing the animals, and in the end, they no longer have, you know, the forest that they used to have, and then they start trying to claim back the land where they used to roam. Like for those of you who may be into elephant research, you may hear that elephants have an amazing memory. They will remember the routes that their maybe 2-3 generations of elephants traveled. So they will try and travel, you know, using those routes to look for water, to look for food. And then naturally, maybe a city has been built or a village has been built and is suddenly obstructing. So you begin to say, without an understanding of, you know, all these dynamics, it may be difficult for me as a storyteller to find ways of using storytelling to actually help, you know, with stories that come up with interventions.
This is the last question because I know we are running out of time, but we have a question from Louisa who is asking, can we find the full story of mushrooms somewhere? And we also have a question that is saying, what are your thoughts about translation of Indigenous stories, the pros and cons? And this is the last question before we close.
Yes, I can make arrangements to give you the mushroom story, the complete story. So yeah, well, we will talk either through you, Hannah, or Anna. Yeah, you have my contact details. I can share that story. Translation is always a problem. Unfortunately, we find ourselves, you know, in a space where English is uniting us. But in the process, as we try to translate our stories into English, I can assure you, so much is lost. So much is, you know, I wish I could tell you a story in my language and then tell you a story in English. You can tell, you know, they are completely different worlds. English for me, when I'm doing storytelling, lacks, it just lacks the tools. You know, besides the gestures, you know, we have the ideophones, we have, it's just, you know, trying to, you know, make do with trying to bake a cake with very little and a lot of missing ingredients. You just then end up, you know, just saying, I wish I had this and that, but now because we don't have that, let's just, you know, pretend this is, you know, good, but not, we know it's not the best. So we have a challenge, but it has to be done. I think this is where we may need also to be very clever and give ourselves a little bit of license, the type of license that Chinua Achebe gave us through Things Fall Apart. You know, where you can tell, this is English, but it's Africanized English. and it is trying very hard to make sure we don't abort the beauty and the richness that you find, in African ways of telling stories. Gloria, I like that. Yes, we lose the pizza.
Yes. So thank you so much once again for everyone that attended this. We are so grateful and super grateful. Thank you for being patient, and thank you, Ignatius, for the amazing stories telling session. There is no debate. You're a natural storyteller, and I'm sure if we had 2 hours or 3 hours, we would have gone on and on and on. We really look forward to your publications and look forward to also still having more conversations about this. And as Anna has said, everyone can put their emails, and also if you have anything to do with beekeeping, a specific bee. Anna said the bee is called, I don't know what bee she said.
It's the bees, they are stingless. There
Stinglers?
are many species. There are many species.
Yes, but if you're dealing with stinglers, or someone who's dealing with or who is doing traditional beekeeping with stinglers, please contact Anna so that they can work together. You can work together. So there is that, and also please follow up the project, because it's still going on the Bosch Alumni Network, and you can also email Anna in case you have any issues or any suggestions or any creative sides that you want to bring forward. Thank you, everybody who has been present. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Ignatius. And I can say a very good evening from Uganda. Mubere bulungi, as we say in our local language. Have an amazing evening. Thank you so much for coming, and see you soon.
See you soon.
Yes.
Great
Thank you.
with you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Hey, Patrick, are you in Estonia?
No, I am in
Yeah.
Slovenia.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Slovenia.
Yeah. I see Ignatius has already left. Shame. I wanted to just say thanks to him also, but I'll reach him anyway. I'll probably take him out for lunch when I get back to Zimbabwe.
Oh, yeah, you're still recording. Maybe you think should stop recording so we can be sure it saves well, I guess. I don't know if